Hello, everyone. Welcome to I-24 News. First, our headlines. U.S. Defense Secretary confirms an arms shipment to Israel was delayed. Hostage negotiations continue as CIA director lands in Israel. And the IAEA chief blasts Iran over its refusal to cooperate. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirms an arms shipment to Israel was delayed. He puts it on Rafah.
And so we're going to continue to do what's necessary to ensure that Israel has the means to defend itself. But that said, we are currently reviewing some near-term security assistance shipments in the context of unfolding events in Rafah.
We'll discuss this in a minute. Meanwhile, it's the second day of the IDF limited action east of Rafah. No advancement further yet. I-24 News' Nicole Tzedek is near the Gaza border with the latest. Nicole.
Yes, we're finding out a little bit more exactly on how this Rafah operation started. The IDF just moments ago releasing new details that when they started to go in, it began with the Israeli Air Force finding different targets in the eastern Rafah area and firing more than 100 targets from the air. Now that laid out the field for then the ground troops to go in and then capture the Rafah, the Gazan side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. And as they're operating these ground troops, they're obviously engaging with Hamas terrorists, many gunfights there. They said initially the IDF was able to eliminate 30 Hamas terrorists in this operation. And not only eliminating Hamas terrorists, but also finding Hamas infrastructure, specifically tunnels that are in this area. And this is important because this is something that the IDF continues to say, that as they are eliminating Hamas, they need to eliminate the Hamas infrastructure that runs all throughout the Gaza Strip, and Rafah being one of the, up until now, untouched places by the IDF inside the Gaza Strip. And so that's why they're going forward with this limited in scope operation, according to the IDF. They're wanting to locate this Hamas infrastructure, eliminate some of the tunnels, and then also by securing the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing, they're trying to make sure that no weapons or funds get smuggled into the Gaza Strip. So also disarming Hamas as well. So this is the main thing that they're working for, and as they are controlling the Rafah border crossing that is closed for humanitarian trucks at the meantime. So because of the pressure from the United States, Israel has opened the Kerem Shalom border crossing. But within the past hour, Hamas fired rockets towards this area of Kerem Shalom once again, even though just today it was opened for humanitarian trucks to go through. Now, we don't have any information yet at this point, just those sirens going through the area not long ago. We are still seeing if any of the rockets actually fell into Israeli territory. Initial reports say that they might have fallen short and landed in the Gaza Strip and not actually made it into Kerem Shalom. But still, this shows that Hamas inside Rafah is still firing at the troops and the humanitarian zone in Kerem Shalom as this operation in Rafah does continue.
Right. Nicole, thank you very much for this update. Here in the studio are Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to Washington, and Amir Oren, Israeli veteran journalist and analyst. Gentlemen, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirms an arms shipment to Israel was delayed because of Rafah. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, I think the emphasis is on delayed, not suspended or not stopped. And he also mentioned that the United States will continue to have Israel's back when it comes to the security, defense challenges, and we'll continue to give Israel anything that it needs for its defense. However, Rafah is a little bit complex. And here I think that the U.S. administration should tap themselves on the shoulder, because they did manage to actually bring Israel to do the minimal operation possible, opening Kerem Shalom. So at the end of the day, we see that with all the rhetoric that comes out of the Prime Minister's office, which is probably for political purposes to allay any concerns of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but he does everything the Americans pretty much ask him to do from day one.
It's not over yet.
It's not over yet.
Right. Amir.
Well, I beg to differ, because Danny here was not even out of his teens when the reassessment took place during the Ford
the
administration.
1975.
1975, you were not yet 20 years old. We won't go into
I was in the military, exactly 20 years
into your
old.
CV. But in any event, I happened to have been involved with both the defense mission in New York and the embassy in Washington, the congressional shop, during this period, and it had its effect. Yitzhak Rabin relented and signed the Sinai disengagement agreement. Now, there was also, of course, the suspension of the F-16s after the Iraqi reactor.
But it wasn't during a war, and we are during a war.
Yes, but what has happened here, and this is a paradox, Israel wants the commander-in-chief to show political will, to deter, but when he asks Netanyahu politely not to do something, Netanyahu, because of what Danny says, Ben-Gvir and the rest, comes out with statements which sound provocative and portray Biden to his domestic audience as weak and ineffective. So there were two signals here, and one must give credit to our colleague Barak Ravid of Axios and Dwella, because he broke this story. First, there was this delay in shipment, but in secret. When the message was not received properly, the story broke. So now it's out in the open. Now Austin refers to it, and everyone knows that there's a price if Israel is a generic term, if Netanyahu, for some reason, does not obey, or at least comply with requests, with wishes. Let's not
Does
call
not
them
respect.
Yes, let's not call them orders, but even though from October 7th on, American officials were here on the ground in general staff meetings, in cabinet meetings, they were watching over Israel very closely. But when it's a public rift, Biden had no other choice.
How much of this, Ambassador, is for internal political consumption in the United States?
Well, there is certainly a conflict between the political interests of the administration, namely Biden, and as time progresses, we're coming to the money time of the campaign. And the conflict is between the campaign managers and there's the strategic advisors, whether it's the national security, whether it's State Department, or even DOD, the Department of Defense. Biden has shown from the day one, from the 7th, that he really has Israel's back. And from a strategic point of view, he made everything to make sure that Israel can defend itself, and it's also an American interest. Strong Israel is an American interest in order to convey to the region that we will not tolerate instability, and that at the end of the day, this stability will keep out Russia and China and so on and so forth. But now I think that the campaigners overrule the strategists, and this is why we see what we see.
The Americans are concerned lest Israel choose two terms, preemption and dimona. They don't want to hear anything regarding these two domains, and therefore they want to bolster Israel's defenses so that Israelis will feel secure, be secure, but also feel secure and will not feel the urge to draw first. Wild West style.
Now, the Americans also insisted to open the Kerem Shalom crossing for humanitarian aid. And yet again, Hamas bombarded Kerem Shalom today. This is quite insane.
Yeah, but this has happened throughout the years. In the 17 years since Hamas took over violently, it has shelled and showed the Gaza population, as well as Israel and Fatah, that it is the master of crossings, just like criminal gangs with protection money. The sad aspect here is that this is aid coming from Jordan, and Israel has an interest in Jordan having some sort of auspices, some sort of patronage over the Palestinian territories, both the West Bank and Gaza. But the Israeli government does almost nothing to secure the passage of the lorries from Jordan to Gaza. It lets the settlers torpedo this passage, and it's either ineffective or devious.
All right, let me bring in Hussein Abdul Hussein from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Good evening, and thank you for joining us again. Let's try to assess the Egyptian and other Arab countries' views in light of what's happening, what we've discussed here.
Well, it seems to me that these Arab governments want to see Hamas disappear, but do not want to spend any capital, political capital, to see it happening. So they have a feeling that the majority of their populations are sympathetic toward Hamas, and that's why, while they want to help the United States and they want to help Israel and they want to see Hamas gone, at the same time, their public rhetoric is way too divorced from what they want to see or from the policy that they want to endorse. So far, this has been the case. Sometimes, we see them, sometimes we see one side of the policy, which is really trying to help and going against Hamas. And at other times, they just issue these populist statements that really don't help the inflamed situation.
But no chance that publicly somebody will, come out and say Hamas has to stop with this, whatever it is.
Well, unfortunately not, even though that we know that Hamas, we know that the Muslim Brotherhood, the parent organization of Hamas, is on the list of foreign terrorist organizations of many Arab countries, whether Egypt or in the Gulf states. And in the case of Hamas, Hamas is on the terrorism list of Gulf states. So despite that, we still have not seen any of these governments treating Hamas as they declare that they treat the Muslim Brotherhood. Their opposition to the idea of Islamism just does not show when they're dealing with this conflict where Hamas is part of. For some reason, they just stop at a point before they denounce Hamas. Now, in peace times, they usually denounce Hamas, but in this specific moment when the world really needs to explain how bad Hamas is, not only to Israel, but for the rest of the region, at this specific point, many of these Arab governments just stop talking.
Let's talk a bit about Jordan. The King Abdullah, has just been to Washington again. What are his concerns?
Well, I don't think anyone would envy the king's position. On one hand, he has a vital interest in keeping all these militias away from Jordan. We know that the Iran regime and the Iranian militias, especially the ones in Iraq and Syria, have been breathing down his neck, threatening to arm militias inside of Jordan, threatening to go to war with the government of Jordan. Of course, we all know that Jordan paid dearly when it ejected the militias, the Palestinian militias, in the 1970s. So the Hashemite monarchy understands the importance of its sovereignty, but at the same time, like I said, it has a population that sometimes sounds very supportive of Hamas. So on one hand, they have policies that want to see peace, that want to see Hamas decline. On the other hand, we hear public statements, and the public statements say something else.
Hussein Abdul Hussein, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Back to the studio, Ambassador Ayalon. The question of Jordan, a very long border with Israel and the West Bank, a key country in the Middle East, and the king is obviously concerned.
Well, Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, has told all his people, of course, the Revolutionary Guard and the proxies, that the key to defeat Israel is Jordan. Because of the long borders and because the Jordanians are so much cooperating on military issues with Israel. So there was a talk about him, the Iranians trying to actually have like 12,000 mujahideen, or whatever you call them, infiltrate into Jordan. Also, we know that they have increased their attempts to smuggle weapons and explosives into the West Bank through Jordan, and they have had some successes over there. And this is certainly not making the political health of the king and the Hashemites and the kingdom any better. Quite the contrary. Of course, he is in a bind because he cannot go against his own population. I guess 75% or so are Palestinians. Hamas cells are very strong. They are pretty much holding on the labor unions. They are in parliament, so he cannot say too much, and he has to hide as much as possible his very deep cooperation with Israel.
Right. If we go back to history, you remember, I'm sure, the phrase, Jordan is the Palestinian state.
Yes,
Ariel
many
Sharon.
Israelis, including Netanyahu.
And Ariel Sharon at the time.
Now, none of the Arab regimes and none of the regional regimes, save Turkey, were rooting for Hamas. They were actually hoping that Israel will make short shrift of Hamas, and they expected the IDF to win over impressively and as soon as possible. And they were all disappointed to see that in 7 months, Israel has been drawn into a war of attrition, has not been able to win over Hamas. The Arab masses will see Hamas, as of now, as being victorious by the very fact that it stood the Israeli military machine, Hamas having no air force, no navy, no armored corps, no air defense, and nevertheless, through the captivity, through the hostage-taking and the tunnels, managed to find a trick which kept the Israelis away, because maybe the IDF could have located Sinwar and killed him. By that, it would have condemned the hostages around him. So up to now, there has been no device to separate Sinwar from the hostages, and therefore Israel, as of now, is losing the war.
Danny, the question of the hostages, there's a lot of fog around what's happening. Hamas says yes, but no. Israel says no way. The Americans are optimistic about it. In Jerusalem, whoever says whatever he says, because it's always confidential, no way, we're not going to have a deal like this. What's happening?
Well, I really do not envy the task of the negotiators, including my good friend Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, because these negotiations or the interest of Hamas and Israel are just confronting directly. And it's a zero-sum game. There is no room for any kind of interfacing or any kind of bridging a happy middle. Hamas, their goal is its survival and survivability. To do that, they need to keep the hostages as long as they can and get guarantees, especially from the United States, that after the last hostage, or dead or alive, is coming back to Israel, Israel will not attack. And of course, Israel, just as Amir said, Israel cannot afford losing the war. And such a result of the negotiations of Israel not being able to continue the operation will be a lose-lose situation. And politically also, there is also a big weight here on the political effect. Bibi will lose his government because Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will not let him sign anything which is short of what they call the total victory.
So it looks very bleak.
The first point that Danny made has a solution. The second one does not, because Bibi's survival is at stake. But the first one, of course, is separating a campaign from the war. The conflict between Hamas and Israel will go on forever. But calling this particular campaign over, of course Hamas will insist on it. In all wars, prisoners are exchanged when the war is over. So it doesn't matter that Hamas is a criminal gang and that they abducted the Israelis and others to begin the war. Now, where we are, in order for Israel to get the hostages who serve as Sinwar's insurance policy. Of course, it will not happen. The last batch, those who are serving as human shields, they will not be coming home until and unless Sinwar gets a pledge that he will not be assassinated.
7 months already. They are in captivity for 7 months. It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable, and I would give it to the and the Shin Bet that they would know pretty much the whereabouts of Sinwar, but there is no way they can have any operation, because if he's surrounded by hostages and they cannot be condemned, as Amir says, this is a real bind for Israel, and this is why I believe the only way to get them out alive is through a political deal, basically.
Which is why Netanyahu's way of solving the problem that we all talked about is to let time go by, less hostages will be available, and then he thinks he can get Sinwar and also delay early elections, because if his government collapses on either side, the messianic pole of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir or the moderate pole of Gantz and Eisenkot, then there will be early elections, demonstrations, protests. It will be the downfall of Netanyahu personally and not only of his government. He cannot win the next elections, so he would rather delay. There is also his trial, where he is about to testify for his defense, and it is a very, very risky proposition for a defendant when he goes to testify. And we are watching the Trump trial right now. Yeah. Netanyahu is also awaiting some rocky waters in his own trial.
All right, let's go to Cairo now. A Jewish businessman was killed in Alexandria, Egypt. It was reported that his name was Ziv Kippur, and he owned a fruit and vegetable export company. So let's turn to journalist Rami Aman in Cairo for more details, if there are any. Rami, tell us about it.
Thank you so much. Yes, yesterday I heard about this story about the businessman. I'm sorry for what happened, but until now, following the Egyptian media and the Israeli media, no one can give an explanation of what happened. Of course, maybe some people saying that it's a crime, other people saying that it's because of what is happening in that world. But with all of terms, I think anyone in this world against any kind of killing against anyone.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Israeli-Egyptian relations. There's growing frustration on both sides. Tell us about the Egyptian side.
Of course, there are a lot of calls between the Israeli and the Egyptian sides, not just since last October, of course, in the last years. But of course, there is another relations between the Israelis and the Egyptians. For me, here in Cairo, I'm here since 3 years. And I visited many places in Egypt, north and south of Sinai, Cairo, Alexandria. I met Jewish, I met Christians, I met Muslims. Here in Egypt, I see that Egyptians welcoming all kind of nationalities. Of course, maybe after the war, the reputation for any Israeli, it's like a change in order of the media, like the media which represent the Palestinians, the support Hamas. But I think the Egyptians here are super friendly every time. And you can see them, and you can see Jewish and Christians in Nuweiba and Dahab, Sharm el-Sheikh, Al-Gada, pyramids, Cairo, downtown. And you will not find any kind of sign against anyone.
All right. Rami Aman in Cairo, thank you very much for that. So we are hearing, Ambassador Ayalon, more and more public frustration from Egypt. Is it only a public play?
I think mostly. I think it's no wonder that Egypt actually took the front seat in the negotiations, taking it from Qatar, because they have a real vested interest of avoiding a Rafah operation. The last thing they need is a stampede of Palestinians, displaced Palestinians, coming into the Sinai. So I think that the Israeli military here pretty much understands the Egyptian concerns, and this is why they're doing it in a very, very, I would say, almost gentle way. So far, for instance, they were advising all the people in Rafah not to move south to Egypt, but rather towards the sea, west and towards the Wasi.
We have about a minute left, but the Egyptians today said that they reconsider their role as mediators. It's that bad?
Well, the mediators should have some leverage over the parties, and if Israel does not care about the Egyptian position, if Hamas does not care, what's in it for them? But the fatal flaw in the Israeli military plan was to start in the north in Gaza rather than in Rafah before there were all of those civilians, the 1.4 million Palestinians. Now it's too late.
Yeah, there's criticism on the IDF. Why did not they start in the north? Any idea why not?
Well, one could see, first of all, they had only half of their troops because the other half was designated for the Lebanon front, should it conflagrate. But then, from the north, it's a short distance, short range to many places in central and south Israel for the rockets. When the war started, rockets and missiles were the big risk, the big danger.
Right.
So there was some argument for it, but if you want to go to the bottom line, it was a mistake.
All right, so we'll talk about the north in length in a minute or so. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more special coverage.
story must reach the whole world. The I-24 News Channel, broadcasting from Israel, with dozens of correspondents throughout the world, brings the truth from Israel to hundreds of millions of people in scores of countries.
Completely gunned down in their beds.
De la frontière qui sépare Israël.
The state of emergency and war in Israel.
Bringing Israel's story to the world. I-24 News Channels. Now on Hot.
Welcome back. Another statement from Israeli Defense Minister today. Yoav Gallant talks about a hot summer in the Israeli-Lebanese front.
A battle of defense is a complex battle. It's a battle where all the time you're expecting the enemy's reactions, and active as well, and I think the entire division has fought excellently. Hezbollah has 3,450 fatalities, together with Amal and Palestinian organisations, and this is recognised. We pushed them back significant distances from the contact point. That doesn't mean it's disappeared, but it's not there anymore. A large part belongs to the guns, the ground forces, the air forces, and the results are impressive. We don't intend to reach a war as part of a concept, but that said, we are examining all alternatives in order to return the civilians to their homes and ensure their securities. And for that, you need either an aggressive or an operational one.
And now I-24 News' Zach Anders is standing by live in northern Israel with another intense day. Zach.
Yeah, and more intense than what we experienced yesterday when Hezbollah claimed responsibility for 9 attacks. Today, they've already claimed responsibility for 11 at this point in the night, coming up on 8 o'clock local time. What has been remarkable is seeing the IDF strike one area, the Ramya village of southern Lebanon, some 20 times. They've released the video. It shows explosions taking place after the strikes, signaling that potentially they struck an ammunition depot, and that was causing secondary explosions. This is within just a few hundred meters of the border fence. It's remarkable to see this level of airstrike activity taking place essentially on the Israeli border. The IDF has also claimed to kill 2 additional Hezbollah operatives. This is remarkable because Hezbollah has not announced any deaths within their ranks in over a week. It's also being reported by the regional council here in the north that although there were no casualties as a result of Hezbollah's strikes today, there was a 6-year-old woman who was injured as she rushed to reach one of the shelters during one of the red alarms. We're seeing that she was transported for medical care at one of the local hospitals. One of the more remarkable attacks came in conjunction with rocket-fired anti-tank guided missile and drone launches all at once in the western Galilee. Hezbollah claiming responsibility for that attack, a joint attack that was using multiple different kinds of projectiles. We're still waiting for a full damage assessment from today. And again, this day is not over, so we're still seeing renewed activity all across this border. And I should note that as the sun has set here in Kiryat Shmona, where we're located tonight, that this is often when we see additional rocket attacks is at night when Hezbollah thinks that they have the cover of darkness to move some of those rocket launchers and attempt to fire on these positions. We've often noted that a lot of these rocket attacks take place after or just after dusk or dark. So we'll continue to keep an eye on this border. It is a major story. I know the world's headlines are focused on Rafah, but this Hezbollah conflict is certainly at a very high clip tonight.
Right. Zach Anders, thank you very much. Live in northern Israel. Back to the studio here, Amir. It appears that Hezbollah has rejected the French offer, signaling that there's not much to talk about.
Well, the French offer was a non-starter to begin with because France doesn't have any leverage. The only players in town are the Americans. Amos Hochstein has been making the rounds. There will be eventually some formula that will be accepted by the parties. And it makes sense for Israel to have a ceasefire in Gaza because this will also carry over to a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Israel could point almost all of its force to Lebanon in case the diplomacy breaks down. And also the residents could start coming back. So that gives you an added impetus for the Gaza talks, which will then influence the northern part of the talks.
Still, Danny Ayalon, it's not going to be easy.
No, well, the latest target date for the return of the border town Israelis in the north was 1st of September.
Beginning of the school year.
Exactly.
But it was delayed now.
And this is delayed. And now we hear that Mr. Netanyahu is saying nothing will happen if it will be delayed for a few months.
They're talking about November 1st.
Yes, and this is something which probably is not acceptable.
It's over a year. Let's just make
but
it.
He's right. Nothing will happen to Netanyahu.
Well, that's the whole thing. The question is whether it will be backlash, political backlash, and here I think that also Netanyahu's interest at the end of the day, although maybe they're not his constituencies up there north, but it is still to bring them back home. Otherwise, you know, they will come out in the streets, and so he has a lot of things waiting for him in that sense. And he would like, I think, also from Israel's strategic point of view, it's better to get a political arrangement with Lebanon. And I suspect also that the Iranians and the Hezbollah also would very much like a political settlement.
But Danny, you have been a member of Knesset and the deputy foreign minister, but in this regard, member of Knesset is more germane. How do you translate the protest, the disappointment at Netanyahu's performance into parliamentary power? As long as he has these 64 fingers, including his own, what does he care?
It's not just the 64. You know, he had the 64 during the attempted
coup, the judicial coup.
Yeah, the judicial revolution, or reform, as it was called, and that did not help him in the streets. Now, he has the cover of Gantz and Eisenkot. If Gantz and Eisenkot leave the government, then I think that would be a real signal for the streets to come out again in full force.
And the government may somehow deflate itself, collapse into itself with some partners that are disappointed, to say the least, from what's happening, and religious parties and so on. But we're not going to get deep into Israeli politics right now. We're going to move to Iran, because it's clear that Iran is not cooperating with the international community regarding its nuclear ambitions. Just ask the IAEA chief who was there. I-24 News' Adam Bernitz reports. Okay, maybe we'll get this report later. Let's watch.
A ticking time bomb. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, came out on Tuesday, strongly criticizing Iran's failure to cooperate with the agency's probe into its nuclear program.
The present state is completely unsatisfactory for me. We have almost at an impasse where nothing is moving apart from the normal, traditional set of inspections under CSA, and this needs to change.
Iran and the UN Nuclear Agency are still discussing how to implement a 2023 deal on inspections. Tensions have grown between Iran and the IAEA since 2018, when then President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew America from Tehran's nuclear deal with world leaders. Since then, Iran has abandoned all limits the deal put on its program and enriches uranium to 60% purity, near weapons-grade levels of 90%. Grossi has already warned that Tehran has enough enriched material at near weapons-grade levels to make several nuclear devices if it opted to do so. He emphasized that the agency cannot guarantee that none of Iran's centrifuges have been utilized under the veil clandestine enrichment. Mohammad Eslami, the head of Iran's atomic energy organization, responded by jabbing at Israel, accusing it of meddling in the relationship between the IAEA and Iran.
This criminal entity has been behind the destructive campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and things raised by this regime should no longer be used as basis for inspection by the IAEA.
Grossi's visit comes at a time of extremely heightened regional tensions, following an unprecedented attack on Israel directly from Iranian soil. and the subsequent yet limited Israeli response a direct warning to Iran that Israel can precisely penetrate defenses that guard Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel has vowed to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Following his visit to Isfahan, Rossi stressed there is no simple measure to deal with the slew of issues that still need to be addressed.
There is some kind of expectation sometimes that there will be like a touch of a magic wand and we will solve issues like this. I'm sorry, this does not exist. It's impossible.
Rossi reaffirmed the validity of the existing agreement with Iran, but called to uphold safeguards and monetary measures to address the international community's concerns. The biggest question still remains unanswered. When will Iran's endeavors cross Israel's red line?
So we have Jason Brodsky, Policy Director of United Against Nuclear Iran. Good to see you again. Well, it's kind of news with no news. Iran is not cooperating. You're shocked.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's the never-ending story of Iran's saga with the IAEA. I think that they're still trying to implement the joint statement from over a year ago between the IAEA and Iran, and there is no news, and it's not because of the fault of the IAEA Director General. He's not at fault. He's only as strong and robust as his mandate and the support he gets from the IAEA Board of Governors, and thus far the U.S. has been very reluctant to apply the requisite pressure on the Islamic Republic to cooperate with the IAEA. It objected to passing a censure resolution at the last IAEA board meeting that some European powers wanted to pursue. So that's where we are.
There was a talk recently about new sanctions after the attack on Israel. Anything happening with this?
There were sanctions that were levied in the U.S. and in Europe, but these are piecemeal sanctions that really don't affect the leadership's decision-making calculus in Iran as to whether the costs of a direct attack on Israel from Iranian soil outweigh the benefits. And I think that the Iranians are taking note that it could get away with a direct attack on Israel, and world powers will levy sanctions, more piecemeal sanctions, and nothing more. And so that's a very dangerous precedent.
And they are getting closer to Russia and China.
Yes, Iran has been deepening partnerships with Russia and China, not only with Russia especially, not only drone transfers, but there are active and advancing conversations on the transfer of missiles as well from Iran to Russia, and that would be a tremendous concern, especially given the ability for Iran to perfect and learn from the experience of using its missiles in a European theater. That is a concern. I think the Europeans are eyeing it very warily, and that should necessitate definite snapback sanctions at the UN Security Council resolution, because that will really put into place once again the arms embargo and the missile restrictions which have lapsed under that resolution.
All right. Okay, Jason Brodsky, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah of Iran, calls upon the world to act against the Iranian regime. Here's his interview with Christian Mallard in Paris. Watch.
Your Highness, as an Iranian and #1 figure of the opposition to the Ayatollah's regime, with the latest developments of the situation between Israel and Hamas, do you fear the prospect of an open conflict between Iran and Israel, and even, I would even say, a third world conflict?
Well, given the circumstances, I'm not surprised that all of us should be quite concerned, particularly me as an Iranian, thinking of how this could have implication against my country. However, there is a solution to this conflict, and the best solution is to eliminate the real threat, which is the nature of the regime, in favor of a population that, contrary to the regime, does not want war, but seeks peace and good relationship with our neighborhood.
Do you think the Westerners have been gullible to the point of thinking they could engage with a terrorist regime which seeks the destruction of Israel?
In short, yes. Well, two things. First of all, an expectation of behavior change was flawed from the beginning. And second, appeasement has never worked. As a result, the regime has shown being more emboldened to continue more repression at home and more aggression abroad. Once again, if we shift the focus not on what is the root cause of the problem, but how to eliminate the problem itself, the only solution, if we want to avoid conflict and war and confrontation, is to have this regime no longer in place. That means a direct policy of support of the Iranian people, who are your natural allies. When I say are natural, I mean the Western free world, as opposed to a regime that from the very beginning was anti-Western, anti-democratic, and is the contrast between night and day.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has made it clear that it is seeking a nuclear arsenal. In your view, what is the best way to contain the regime's nuclear ambitions?
Well, I think the ultimate solution is to eliminate the finger on the trigger, which is the nature of the regime. Short, you have to increase more pressure. Every time there's been more pressure on the regime, it has backtracked on its virulent attitude. But the long-term solution is, again, the elimination of the regime itself, because no matter what, the regime is a threat because of its nature. You cannot transform a wolf into a sheep. It is in the DNA of the wolf to be a predator. This regime operates the same way. It has to ultimately export an ideology, and it has done that. The only solution is to have a democratic alternative to this regime, which is what the Iranian people seek. And as a result, you will have, in the spirit that democracies don't go at war with one another, a nation that would be committed to regional stability, would be committed to peace, with brotherly relationships with our neighborhood, whether it's the Arab world or the Israelis, because that's in our best advantage in terms of national interest. This regime doesn't care about Iranian interest, or for that matter, the people. It only seeks its own survival. With that rationale, it will use any means at its disposal to succeed, including nuclear weapons, if it had to. That's why we have to eliminate the problem by eliminating the regime. You're not going to do that through negotiation with it, or through appeasement, or through an expectation of behavior change.
In your view, Your Highness, what is the Islamic Republic's role in regional instability, and how does it affect prospects for normalization between Israel and its neighbors?
Well, I mean, the policy of the Khamenei has been neither war nor peace, meaning maintaining the ring of fire, which is really supporting his proxies, arming them, training them, financing them. As a result, you see October 7th and Hamas attack against Israel, or what the Houthis are doing in the region. This is all correlated. The contrast to that would be a nation that seeks stability. You know, I mentioned the fact that if we had a successful story until the regime sabotaged it with the Abraham Accords, add to it the Cyrus Accord, which includes Iran in that package, where all the neighborhood will work together in friendship and cooperation. That's the best way out of this quagmire. So short term, maximum pressure on the regime, but add to it, and parallel to that, maximum support for the Iranian people. The only way to avoid conflict and military sense is to seek the third way, which is supporting the Iranian people to get rid of this regime and instead bring about a nation that is truly represented by a democratic government. And our aspirations as a nation for human rights, for freedom, for democracy, and for brotherly relationship is the element that will change la donnée, as we say in French, and therefore will change completely the scenario and prospects of the near future and beyond.
A number of polls, Your Highness, place you by a wide margin as the most favored political personality inside and outside Iran. How do you respond to these numbers?
Well, I'm both humbled and proud as a result, knowing that there's so much respect and trust in me, which simply makes it more effective for me to play the role of a transitional leader and help the process of change in Iran by bringing about an end to this regime, and then facilitate a process where democratically we'll be able to choose our future and our destiny. And that's the role I intend to play, and I've always said that I will do that, and therefore it appears that now there's even more impetus and more moral obligation on me to perform that role.
So when can we expect Reza Pahlavi in Tehran?
As soon as our country is liberated. I'd like to be among my fellow compatriots and be able to start rebuilding our country and help it come back to the fold of the free and modern progressive world.
Your Highness, many thanks for having answered our questions on I-24 News, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you, Christian. Appreciate it.
Still in the neighborhood of Iran, President of the Kurdistan region of Iraq has described his two-day trip to Tehran as a new beginning in relations with Iran. So we have Intifad Kanbar with us, President and founder of Kurdish Protection Action Committee. Thank you very much for joining us again. Iranian President Raisi asked the president of the Iraqi Kurdistan region, Barzani, to prevent attacks on Iran, and he was enthusiastic about everything. What do you think about that?
Well, Jacob, the Kurds have learned and mastered the art of walking fire lines, especially the Barzanis. They have fought Saddam and they dealt with Saddam, and they have got help from the Shah, and the Shah let them down in 1975. Then the Islamic regime in Tehran hosted the Iraqi opposition and the Kurds at times of difficulties. So there's a mixed up relation. However, the Kurds are too small to fight or to start a fight. They never started a fight. They only act on self-defense. Mr. Nachirvan Barzani grew up in Iran as a refugee, and he speaks fluent Persian. So he's very much liked by the Iranian officials who knew him since his childhood, and through his uncle, Masoud Barzani, President Masoud Barzani, through his father, the late his father, he may rest in peace. So, Iran is a major neighbor. There's 1,300 miles of kilometers of border between Iraq and Iran. And the Iraqis, including the Kurds, have done with fighting Iran. We fought Iran for 8 years, and we lost about 500,000. I myself served 5 years fighting Iran and lost 4 cousins fighting Iran. So we don't want to have animosity relationship. Also, we don't want to have hegemony of the Iranian powers in Iraq. We want a balanced, mutual respect relationship.
What's the future in that case? Who's going to be the biggest ally of the Kurds?
The Kurds will never abandon their alliance with the United States of America. As I told you, they have learned, especially the Barzanis, how to walk a fine line. For decades, they maintain excellent relation with the United States. Mullah Mustafa Barzani, the great leader, while at the same time he had maintained excellent relationship with the communist Soviet Union and the communist bloc. So this is not new to them, and they need to do that. They have to balance relation with Turkey. They have to balance relation with Iran. Unfortunately, Iraq is surrounded by not the nicest neighbors, like Israel as well. And you, the Israelis, have made peace with people you fought for many decades. So this is a survival strategy.
All right. Intifad Kanbar, thank you very much. We'll leave it at that. And let me go to I-24 News senior correspondent Bianca Zanini at the women's protest for the hostages in Tel Aviv. Bianca, what's happening there?
Hi, Yaakov. Well, as you can hear and see behind me, the protest is just starting. We can hear the drums, the chants, and honestly, the sentiment here is quite desperate. It seems that people are getting more and more angry and more desperate by the day. The protest is going to be a march going from the center of Tel Aviv, Habima Square, to the IDF headquarters. And the protesters are calling for the release of the hostages. One of the main slogans here tonight is it's death or it's a deal or a death sentence for the hostages. They're saying they're not interested in entering Rafah. They're not interested in political games. They want the release of the hostages, and they don't want any more deaths, neither on either side of this conflict. Now, the protest tonight is organized by the Women's Protest for the release of the hostages, but other groups are also joining. More and more people are expected to join. Organizers say they're expecting thousands of Israelis to join in the streets and join in the calls for action. Now, one of the organizers here is with me here tonight. Tell me, thank you first of all for being with us. Tell me, why are you here tonight?
Okay, it's day 215 that 132 Israeli citizens are in Gaza in captivity with Hamas. And we're here to call the government of Israel. There's a deal now on the table. We're here to call the government of Israel to do everything in its power to close this deal. It's been 7 months already where Israeli citizens and citizens of other nationalities as well are held in Gaza. There's no more time left where they're running out of time. Each day we're announced more and more hostages are announced to be dead. Yesterday we were informed that another hostage is dead, and they're just running out of time. There's no time left.
Do you have any expectations that you will be able to reach the government through these protests?
Yes, I think that most of the Israeli citizens want a deal, understand that the only way to bring these hostages back home alive is through a deal and not through military action. So the Israeli public and people are in support of the deal, and it's very important that we constantly tell the government what we feel, what the Israeli people feel and think should be done.
I've seen that one of the main signs and slogans tonight is it's either a deal or a death sentence, and we don't want to see Israel entering Rafah. What's the situation looking to you right now? If you look at what's happening right now, are you hopeful?
Yes, I'm always hopeful. Like one of the mothers of one of the hostages says, hope is mandatory, even though it's been very, very long, but 7 months, like I said. But today, the cabinet, the war cabinet is meeting, and we're marching there where the war cabinet is meeting to tell them what we think, what we feel should be done.
All right. Thank you very much. And back to you in the studio, Yaakov.
Thank you very much, Bianca Zanini in Tel Aviv. That's it for now. Stay tuned for more news with Kalev Ben David here on I-24 News. Have a good night from Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv is ranked the happiest city in the world and the best place to own a home. For 3 generations, the Ben Shalom family has built boutique apartment buildings in the most desirable locations. From restoration in historical locales to homes along Park Hayarkon, Ben Shalom is a one-stop shop from start to finish and friends for life.
Esta semana en News 24, Israel bajo ataque. News 24 en español trae el análisis y la información de los acontecimientos de la guerra Espadas de Hierro.
Entrevistas exclusivas, reportes desde la zona de guerra, la reacción de los países hispanoparlantes.
News 24, el único medio en español que te mantiene informado y conectado con la comunidad latina en Israel. News 24, únicamente en I-24 News.
Natasha Kirchuk, and this is I-24 News. It is day 215 of the Israel-Hamas war. Now, Israel has been seeing heavy rocket fire out of both the Gaza Strip and Lebanon throughout the day, with the latest barrage of 8 missiles fired at southern Israel from Rafah, the southernmost area of the Gaza Strip. Now, this comes as the Israeli army is continuing to operate in eastern Rafah, mainly near the area of the border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, but is not advancing towards the main city of Rafah itself. Now, the operation, though limited in its nature so far, is already receiving international condemnation. Israel is being criticized for its takeover of the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, where the IDF says that Hamas is continuing to smuggle goods and even fighters through underground terror tunnels. Still, AIDS groups are expressing concern about what will happen to the over 1 million displaced Palestinians sheltering in Rafah if Israel expands its operations. Well, Israel has now reopened the Kerem Shalom crossing into Gaza after 4 soldiers were killed in a rocket barrage from Gaza over the weekend. Humanitarian aid convoys are now resuming entry into the enclave amid a dire humanitarian crisis. So what is happening with the ceasefire and hostage release deal? Well, the chief of the CIA has met with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel today with the goal of advancing the negotiations. Israel sent a delegation to Cairo yet again to see if an agreement can still be reached after Hamas made headlines by claiming that it had agreed to a truce deal that it had heavily changed and did not actually align with what Israel had originally accepted. Well, joining us now to discuss is the former Israeli consul in Los Angeles, Yaki Dayan, and Yaakov Lapina, military and strategic affairs analyst at the Miriam Institute. Good evening. All right, so let's talk about this deal that's on the table. There's a lot of confusion as to what Hamas actually accepted here. What did Hamas agree to? And what are the sticking points for Israel, where Israel says this is absolutely a no-go?
So I'll start then. Hamas is refusing to release the number that was agreed upon, the 33, in the first phase, the 33 hostages. What they are saying is that part of them will be alive and some of them are going to be bodies. They are not specifying the numbers. Mm-hmm. The second point that Hamas is saying is that they want to see a complete cessation of war. And the third thing, which I know, is according to the timetable. It was agreed, or the initial proposal was that every 3 days, 3 hostages are going to be released. The Hamas is saying that more than that, it will take a week till the first will be released, and then on and on and on, not every 3 days. Mm-hmm. So those are the sticking points, no doubt. But more than anything else is the cessation of war, which the Hamas is requesting, and definitely Israel is not willing to agree on that.
Right. We're talking about a situation in which Hamas is saying we're not going to agree to any deal without a permanent ceasefire at the end. And Israel is saying that's just not going to happen until you surrender and lay down your arms. But is that realistic at this point? And does Israel really have any bargaining power over Hamas, given that even the United States does not seem to be getting Hamas to make any serious changes in its negotiations?
Yeah, it doesn't look like the United States is trying very hard either, because when Hamas came back with its counter offer, it did not accept the Israeli offer, as was falsely claimed by many observers. It actually just came back with its own offer and kind of fabricated the idea that this was accepting the offer on the table. There was nothing of the sort. This was an attempt to push Israel into accepting Hamas's terms. Look, Israel has leverage now because it's moved into Rafah. It's moved into Rafah crossing. The Hamas leadership now sees that the Israeli military is in Rafah. It sees that its human shields are being stripped away in eastern Rafah. So we're seeing multiple pressure points being applied to the Hamas leadership, which did not exist before the Rafah operation. That's one of the major reasons why Israel finally launched the Rafah operation. Without that, there would be no leverage, and basically we would just be begging a group of fanatical jihadists to accept a better term. So now there is leverage.
Interesting. I want to further discuss that. We're going to turn now to the Israel-Gaza border, where our correspondent Nicole Sedek joins us. We'll be back with you shortly. Nicole, what are the latest updates on the fighting in Gaza, and specifically, of course, in the Rafah area?
Yes, well, we are getting an update from the IDF as to how this operation inside Rafah exactly started. They say it started with fighter jets actually targeting more than 100 targets in some of these eastern Rafah areas to kind of lay the groundwork for then the troops to go in. And when the troops started operating in the eastern Rafah neighborhoods, they did engage with gunfights with Hamas terrorists. The IDF says at this point they've eliminated more than 30 Hamas terrorists and gunmen in the area, and all while working to then capture the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing, which the IDF has secured, and in the meantime also locating plenty of Hamas terror infrastructure, including plenty of tunnels as well in the Rafah neighborhood. And this does indicate exactly what the IDF has been saying, that the large network of tunnels truly do run all throughout the entirety of the Gaza Strip, not just in the north and central part where the IDF had operated so far, but also in the southernmost spot in Rafah. And so this is all part of the IDF's plan with this so far limited in scope operation. They want to continue to discover this Hamas terror infrastructure, and also by gaining access to the Rafah border crossing, they're trying to cut off any access to smuggling of weapons and funds to also disarm Hamas and their capabilities inside the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, as the Rafah crossing has been shut off, the IDF has opened the Kerem Shalom border crossing after it was shut for a few days following a deadly incident where Hamas fired rockets towards Israeli soldiers, firing those rockets from Rafah. And as IDF is still operating deeper in some of these eastern Rafah neighborhoods, Hamas continues to fire rockets. We saw today another siren sounding in Kerem Shalom once again today. Now, the reports indicate at this point that some of those rockets actually fell short and landed in the Gaza Strip, but the intent by Hamas is still there, firing from Rafah towards a humanitarian zone that's supposed to be delivering humanitarian deliveries to the Palestinian civilians. Now, in that expanded humanitarian zone where some of the 100,000 Palestinians in the eastern Rafah neighborhood had been asked to evacuate in the Al-Mawasi and Khan Yunis area. And meanwhile, we do want to tell you, Natasha, as more operations do continue, not just in Rafah, but in some of the areas in the more of the central and northern part as well. The IDF says that they eliminated the Gaza City's chief naval commander. And throughout the course of this war, they said this man, Ahmed Ali, was responsible for planning multiple attacks on IDF troops, even most recently attacks on troops operating in the Netzarim corridor in the northern central part of the Gaza that kind of splits the Gaza Strip in two. So they were able to eliminate that. The IDF still going after some of the top targets really all throughout the Gaza Strip as they continue their military operations.
All right, Nicole, thanks for joining us. You'll be back with us later on I-24 News. You know, I want to discuss with our guests just briefly, you know, I do have a question in regards to the Rafah operation. In your eyes, you know, you suggested right now that this was essentially Israel sending a message to Hamas: if you don't move forward in negotiations with us and actually show flexibility, we're going to teach you a lesson. But are we going to see the opposite end up taking place here? Because we are hearing Hamas officials say, you know, now that Israel has launched a ground offensive in Rafah, even if it's limited in its manner, you know, this is going to impede actually the talks that we have around the table.
So I don't think it's about teaching Hamas a lesson or anything like that. I think it's essentially what's happened here is Israel has taken the initiative after a month of being out of the Gaza Strip, having very little military forces, very little leverage, and we see Hamas sticking to its basic terms, which are an end to the war to enable it to survive, retake the Gaza Strip, rebuild its terror army, and then come back to October 6th reality. That's what Hamas wants. That's why it's holding these hostages. Israel can never accept that. That's suicidal for Israeli security. Sorry, I have some water stuck in my throat. So essentially, Israel is trying to make Hamas's leadership soften its position. And this operation is designed to do one of two things. Either it's going to result in a softening of Hamas's leadership position, in which case there will be a deal. Right. Or if not, it's designed to continue going and expanding. And it's got exit points. We're just seeing the first stage of this operation. There are several additional stages. Every stage has an exit point, a potential exit point, or an expansion point. It's like a T-junction, and Israel will continue to take those decisions based on what Hamas is doing.
All right, we're going to come back to both of our guests shortly. More and more Israelis are taking to the streets to demand an immediate hostage release deal, including the families of the hostages themselves. Today saw protesters block rush hour traffic on Tel Aviv's main highway. This comes after Kibbutz Nir Yitzhak announced the death of its resident, 61-year-old Lior Rudaef, who was believed to be alive and held hostage in Gaza. Now, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum says that Rudaef was killed on October 7th and that his body has been kidnapped by Hamas terrorists and is currently being held in the Strip. The army has discovered new video material revealing his death. Now, Lior was an ambulance driver and a volunteer medic who was killed when he went out to help protect his kibbutz following Hamas's infiltration. And the news has very much shaken the families of the hostages, and more released hostages are now speaking out against the government, including 21-year-old Mia Shem, who says that since she was freed from captivity in Gaza, not one government representative has spoken to her. Well, joining us now from Tel Aviv is our correspondent, Bianca Zanini. Bianca, what are we hearing from families on the ground where you are, and where are you?
Hi, Natasha. I am in the center of Tel Aviv. A few minutes ago, this large group of people, you can see the protests here, left Habima Square, which is in the center of Tel Aviv, and they are now marching all the way to the IDF headquarters, which is about 15 minutes away, stopping every few minutes to chant and to raise their signs. The key slogans of tonight are no to Rafah, no to Rafah, yes to the hostages. Basically, they're saying that they need a deal or it's going to be a death sentence for the hostages. Honestly, Natasha, the protests are not new, but the desperation seems to be growing by the day. More and more people are joining in, and the slogans and the chants are getting angrier and more desperate, really. We have here with us to talk one of the relatives of one of the hostages here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your uncle is still in Gaza. Why are you here tonight?
We are here tonight to put pressure on the Israeli government, because the Israeli government is not bringing our loved ones back, and it's taking so long, and the situation is not getting any better. And we know for a fact that there is a deal on the table. They can reach a deal. They just need to sit down, cease fire, and sit down to the negotiation table and reach an agreement, because the hostages have no time left. Their time has run out.
So what do you think is preventing this deal from going forward? And do you think that protests like this can change anything?
The main thing that damaging, preventing for getting the deal done is Benjamin Netanyahu's political survivability, because he's been choked by his members of the extreme right-wing members of his cabinet. So he can't reach an agreement without endangering his own administration. So this is why we're not seeing the hostages back. This is just political cynicism.
You know, we were talking right before we went on air about how this has just taken over so many people's lives. I mean, we're seeing near daily protests around the country.
People's lives have stopped. A lot of people have stopped their life, and we are waiting for our loved ones to come back, and it's like in a status. This whole situation is surreal. We are. You know, there are people who are counting the days since October 7th, and we don't see an end. There's no silver lining to this situation. We're just completely desperate. The only hope we can have is from the American administration. The Israeli government, we're completely, out of hope. They cannot help us. They will not help us. They didn't do this for the past 7 months. They will not start doing this now.
All right, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Natasha, no silver lining. That's what the protesters are saying, and calling for the hostages to come home.
All right, Bianca, thank you so much for joining us with the I guess, the nephew of Avraham Munder. He's a 78-year-old hostage who has been held in the Gaza Strip after being kidnapped from his home on October 7th, over 200 days now in captivity. I'd like to turn back to our guests in the studio. I mean, you just heard what that family member of one of these hostages was saying, that basically these families have lost hope in their own government, that they believe that it's now political maneuvers that are threatening the return of their loved ones alive. What is your response to that?
Israel has set from the very beginning, the Israeli government has set from the very beginning 2 red lines. One is the dismantling of the military and administrative capabilities of the Hamas, together with the releasing the hostages, obviously. And the second red line was not redrawing the Israeli defense forces before the operation has been completed. And during the negotiations, those points are very crucial points. And I would say that one of the things, if we're talking and looking for the mistakes that the Israeli government has done, is they lost the leverages on the Hamas, because once the IDF forces stopped the military offense and took out the IDF, and you have tripled the humanitarian aid, mainly by the pressure of the United States government, you lost all the leverages that you had on the Hamas. So that's why entering Rafah was inevitable now, because you want to renew the leverages that you have on the Hamas. One other mistake is that the Israeli government so far has not managed to do anything to create some kind of an alternative to the Hamas, mainly in the northern part of Gaza, in which the Hamas forces are very scarce. So you have to create an alternative force, but you have to renew leverages on the Hamas. And I would say some were done, some were not by the Israeli government, and that's the problem.
All right, well, we're going to turn now to the north of Israel. It has been a difficult day on Israel's northern front. Rocket sirens have been sounding in northern Israeli communities throughout the day. Most recently, 2 anti-tank missiles have hit Kibbutz Malkiah, and earlier another missile hit a house in the town of Metula. Now, the Israeli army has been striking back at Hezbollah targets, mainly in southern Lebanon. According to the IDF, Air Force fighter jets and artillery forces struck over 20 targets used by the terror group, including weapons storage facilities and other military buildings in the area of Ramiyeh in southern Lebanon. 3 people were killed in Lebanon in these strikes. And here's what Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has to say about the ongoing situation, as more than 80,000 Israelis remain displaced from their homes in the north.
A battle of defence is a complex battle. It's a battle where all the time you're expecting the enemy's reactions, and active as well, and I think the entire division has fought excellently. Hezbollah has 3,450 fatalities, together with Amal and Palestinian organisations, and this is recognised. We pushed them back significant distances from the contact point. That doesn't mean it's disappeared, but it's not there anymore. A large part belongs to the guns, the ground forces, the air forces, and the results are impressive. We don't intend to reach a war as part of a concept, but that said, we are examining all alternatives in order to return the civilians to their homes and ensure their securities. And for that, you need either an aggressive or an operational one.
All right, we're going to turn now to our correspondent, Zach Anders, who is joining us live from the north of Israel. Zach, how many rockets and drones have been fired into Israel today, and how does this compare to recent days?
Quite a bit. And we've seen Hezbollah claim responsibility for 11 attacks. I believe there has been more on military installations. They're claiming responsibility for at least 11. Yesterday, they claimed responsibility for 9. So, and this is just at this point in the night. We could continue to see cross-border fire. What has been remarkable is at one point in the Western Galilee, Hezbollah, and they did say that they were behind this attack, launched drones, rockets, and a apparently the ATGMs were launched as well, and that is going to involve personnel being very close, Hezbollah being very close to the border when they're firing those. And they say they launched a joint attack of these different munitions. No reports of casualties. We are seeing some damage reports come in, nothing too extensive. It's likely we haven't got the full damage assessment yet at this point in the night either. We are seeing in Lebanon some of these IDF strikes in Rahway. There was as many as 20 strikes in that village alone. One of those such strikes caused what appears to be a cook-off, ammunition that was already there exploding, secondary explosions signifying that this could have been someplace that Hezbollah was storing some additional weaponry. With these strikes, some of them, as the IDF has released the video, you have to imagine they're leaving scorch marks on the border fence because of how close these strikes were taking place, just a few dozen feet from the border wall. Really remarkable to see. That was the closest the IDF was striking today. The farthest from what we know was about 11 miles north. The IDF just about 10 minutes ago releasing a statement saying they were striking a Radwan forces compound about 11 miles north of the border. I believe that's the farthest strike that took place today. That's just what's confirmed. There could have been others. We don't have an exact number for the totality of the IDF strikes that have been taking place, but several Lebanese commentators in their media apparatus commenting that the wave of airstrikes that were taking place throughout the day were intense, and I saw one commentator in Lebanon say the most intense they had seen in a long time in southern Lebanon. And we could see some of those strikes from our position in Kiryat Shimona as well. So a recap here, 11 attacks at this point in the night. The defense minister, who was in the north today, saying this could be something somewhat of a hot summer. He said remarkable comments from him as he's once again signaling that he wants to see a return of residents to the north. But how can you make that happen with this level of activity and this level of cross-border fire? And a week again where we have seen the air defenses here failed to intercept more Hezbollah drones. Over the course of this conflict, the IDF has made it a point and emphasis to kill the Hezbollah operatives who operate these drones, who have the expertise and the knowledge on how to use these weapons, the Iranian-supplied drones, and still we see these drones penetrate Israeli airspace for some length, some distance, and be able to hit their mark. And it is one of those things that you cannot have happen if you're going to be returning civilians to the north. So as perhaps that's why the defense minister ended his comments here in the north, saying it could be a very hot summer.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Zach, so much for joining us. I'd like to turn back to our guests in the studio. That was a quote that I was actually going to refer to when asking the two of you whether or not what we're seeing is an escalation and what that means in the grand scheme of the various threats that Israel is facing. At the end of the day, we now have the army in Rafah. And the assumption is that we could see more forces going into that area of the Gaza Strip in the coming weeks, months, whatever amount of time it may take. And at the same time, we're dealing with a very, very real and what appears to be growing threat from Lebanon. We're also talking about anti-tank missiles that are just shot on a daily basis, directly hitting homes in Israeli communities. How long can Israel go on without turning this into a hot summer?
So, first of all, the anti-tank missiles, I think, is an indication that claims that we've heard, including from Gallant, that Hezbollah has been pushed back from the border are false. You cannot fire an anti-tank missile from very far away. 5, 10, 11 kilometers usually is the maximum range. They're firing anti-tank missiles. They're at the border. They haven't gone anywhere. And it would be nice if the government could at least acknowledge that a limited campaign of defense is never going to be enough to push Hezbollah back from the border. How long can this continue? Well, it's gone on for almost 7 months. And I think that the War Cabinet is basically very much hoping that when the Rafah operation comes to an end after a ceasefire deal or with or without a ceasefire deal, they hope that Hezbollah will then end its attacks and that an unofficial ceasefire will descend on the north. That's their hope. If that fails to happen, then I think we will see an order for the IDF to move into southern Lebanon and we will enter a war situation with Hezbollah. Those are the two main scenarios going forward. Everything depends on what Hezbollah does when the fighting in Gaza tapers down. The question is it wise to let Hezbollah make all the decisions here?
All right, very quick answer here, because I know
there is a short-term answer and a long-term answer. The
Right.
short-term answer is no one wants to see an escalation of this war. Neither Hezbollah nor Israel, and especially not the Americans. But the long-term answer is that if you want to have a change in the region and you want to push back Hezbollah and allow the Israeli refugees to go back to their homes, some kind of a military operation is needed.
All right. Well, we are going to go out for a quick commercial break right now. Obviously, there is much left to be discussed, especially Iran. We're going to be talking about Iran and its impact on the region in the next few minutes. So make sure to stick with us. We will be back shortly. I'm Natasha Kirchak. This is I-24 News. Don't go anywhere.
Israel's story must reach the whole world. The I-24 News Channel, broadcasting from Israel, with dozens of correspondents throughout the world, brings the truth from Israel to hundreds of millions of people in scores of countries.
Completely gunned down in their beds.
De la frontière qui sépare Israël. The state of emergency and war in Israel.
Bringing Israel's story to the world. I-24 News Channels. Now on Hot.
And we're back on I-24 News. I'm Natasha Kirchak, and thanks for sticking with us. Well, the United States has confirmed that it recently held up a large shipment of 2,500-pound bombs out of fear that Israel might use them in a ground operation in Rafah, which is that southernmost city in Gaza. Now, this is the first time that the U.S. has held up a weapons shipment for the IDF, which it's been supplying on a consistent basis since Hamas's violent infiltration of Israel on October 7th. Joining us now from New York is our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. Mike, Washington has adamantly opposed a major offensive in Rafah and, maintained it's maintained its statement that there's basically no way Israel can ensure the safety of the over 1 million Palestinians sheltering there. But we really haven't seen that big of a response from the U.S. since the start of Israel's ground operation in eastern Rafah yesterday. In fact, some Biden spokespeople signaled their initial approval of the operation that was launched by Israel.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference there in between what the Biden administration is willing to accept in terms of a large ground incursion, in terms of large measures of airstrikes and more limited targeted operations like we saw in the eastern portion of Rafah by Israel earlier this week. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense here in the U.S., the first Biden official to go on the record as saying that indeed a shipment of weapons has been held up. He testified in front of Congress today. Senator Lindsey Graham, who questioned Secretary Austin, said that the move was obscene and absurd as well as offensive. Austin testifying that one shipment of some 3,500 bombs, as you mentioned, in the weight classes of 2,500 pounds were held up. He said no decision has been made yet, but of course, just pausing that shipment is a decision in and of itself. He says he is reviewing right now whether it's appropriate to make that shipment to Israel, given the United States stance on Rafah and the differing opinions, we'll say, of where the Israeli government and military think the operation needs to go from here. So certainly growing tensions in that regard between the U.S. and Israel, though Austin did say the cooperation has never been tighter. And we also heard that same sentiment from Daniel Hagari, the spokesman for the IDF, earlier today, speaking at a conference. So still cooperation on many levels, though obviously many disagreements between Washington and Jerusalem at the moment.
I mean, what does this decision essentially mean in terms of U.S. support for Israel?
Well, we keep hearing the term ironclad commitment to security, ironclad commitment to Israel's defense, to its existence, to its ability to defend against enemies. But there is a growing line that Biden administration officials are willing to at least consider, if not draw, that many Democratic senators are willing to consider, if not draw, in terms of the difference between offensive weaponry, like these heavy bombs that can be used in dense urban areas that would create a lot of destruction and, according to the U.S. government, too many civilian casualties, and what are considered defensive weapons, Iron Dome, David Sling, things of that nature that can defend against incoming rockets and missiles and drones. And what we're seeing now is more consternation, more discussion, and more perhaps lines being drawn between giving Israel what it needs to defend itself and giving Israel what it needs to go on the offensive against its enemies, even if it means it's survival in the end. You can't do it alone on defensive weaponry. You've got to have that ability to deter, that ability to attack when necessary, and that's the case that Israel's making right now. We can't just rely on defensive weaponry. Got to give us what it takes to hit back against the likes of Hamas and take them out of commission, and those are very serious discussions, both at the military level and the political echelon, ongoing right now between Washington and Jerusalem. What it means in the long term, very much up in the air. What it means in the short term, I think, is much more consequential as to how things go forward, both domestically and in foreign policy, both in the United States and Israel.
All right, Mike, thank you so much for joining us with that breakdown. Now, the world is focused on the fate of those living in Rafah following the start of Israel's ground operation in the eastern part of the city yesterday. So far, that operation is limited, but AIDS groups are deeply concerned about the over 1 million displaced Gazans who are sheltering in the southern city and whether or not they'll actually be able to safely evacuate in the event of a larger Israeli operation. Well, 7 months into the war, the fighting has reportedly damaged or destroyed over half of all homes in Gaza, and it's believed that it could take around 14 years to remove the vast amount of rubble. And the World Food Program says that over 1 million people in Gaza are now suffering catastrophic levels of hunger. Well, Israel says it's significantly increased the amount of humanitarian aid making it into the enclave, but the question is, where is it going? Well, joining us now from Turkey is veteran war correspondent Arwa Damon, and our guests in studio are also going to participate in this conversation as well. So, Arwa, I'd like to first begin with you. What do we know about the amount of humanitarian aid that is currently making it into the Gaza Strip at this point, and whose hands is it going into?
Well, right now at this stage, over the last few days, almost no humanitarian aid has made it into Gaza with the closing down, obviously, of the Kerem Shalom border crossing, and then when the IDF took over the Rafah border crossing, which had actually closed 24 hours prior to that operation to push into Rafah. So that is obviously raising massive alarm bells across the entire humanitarian sector, because nothing has gotten in from that access point, and the other potential access points, such as Erez, have not really been opened, nor are they capable of sort of sustaining the level of aid that is required across the Gaza Strip. Add to, all of that, there's also growing concern over what is now a fuel shortage, with a number of organizations warning that they are very close, from a few days away from entirely running out of fuel, which would, put another damper on top of aid operations. And then we also, again, have, a significant population on the move following these evacuation orders, with nowhere to really go to where there is adequate shelter or sanitation, or medical supplies, or even basic necessities. So it's really challenge, compounding challenge, compounding challenge, of course, all of which is exacerbating the suffering of the Gazan population right now.
Is there a feasible way to evacuate the Gazans who are displaced in Rafah if, in fact, decide to carry out a larger operation?
In theory, technically, there would be a better way than what we have seen over the last 7 months when it comes to the need to evacuate civilian populations. One would, in theory, to have sufficient time to prep adequate shelter. So, for example, Israel would need to consider allowing in significantly large numbers of housing container units. Could be an option to be set in some of these other neighborhoods, other areas that have already been cleared. Medical facilities, field hospitals need to be relocated from Rafah to other, again, that is also something that takes time. And then supply lines, logistics and such need to also be moved to other areas, because right now Rafah is sort of the epicenter, the hub for all logistics operations, for all humanitarian organizations. But again, this is something that would take a level of cooperation between Israel and humanitarian organizations that has been lacking up until this point. And it would also take, time. It would take a little bit of time, but it is not beyond the scope of comprehension. That's something that is perhaps more humane than the scenario we're sitting right now could in fact be put into effect.
Now, Israel has continuously insisted that it must enter Rafah because it must take out the remaining 4 Hamas battalions that remain there and are basically functioning amidst the mass civilian population that is displaced there. Israel also believes that many of its hostages are being held captive in that area, given the fact that the last 2 who were rescued were being held in an apartment in Rafah. What is Israel at this point supposed to do in terms of targeting Hamas, given the fact that it continues to hide amongst its own civilians?
And that's sort of been the matter from the very beginning. I think, obviously Israel is facing a much bigger challenge in Gaza than any other army has faced in modern history. But that being said, there are also, certain ways to go about conducting urban warfare that do not necessarily involve leveling entire neighborhoods or entire buildings just to take out 1 or 2 fighters, especially given that Israel is repeatedly saying that is also among the civilian population. We also know that Israel has very highly capable, intelligence capacities. One would hope that at this stage, Israel would choose the option of carrying out targeted strikes against high-value individuals, as opposed to putting an entire civilian population, including its own, at an even risk. There are ways to go about conducting urban warfare that do not involve the collective punishment of an entire population. And again, and I say this over and over again, Gaza is not just jeopardizing the population of Gaza, but also the safety and the security of the hostages themselves.
I'd like to turn to our guests in studio. Yaakov, is Israel doing enough to protect civilians on the ground in the Gaza Strip?
Israel is doing more than any Western military has done in modern military conflict history. It has already moved more civilians than any Western military has moved in recent wars. We're talking about going to extraordinary lengths to try and move civilians out of harm's way. We saw over 1 million civilians given time to leave Gaza City, and now the same is happening in Rafah. Now, in terms of targeted operations, the IDF is actually conducting targeted operations where it can, which is most of Gaza. Targeted operations are what's happening in northern Gaza and most of central Gaza. Rafah is a completely different situation. Hamas is still deeply entrenched there because the IDF hasn't moved in. And that's why targeted operations would be completely inadequate. It would actually be a suicide mission for these security forces that would embark on it at this stage.
I would make a point on the humanitarian aid. I mean, we should put things in context. The crossing point of Kerem Shalom was closed because the Hamas fired rockets on Kerem Shalom. So that's why humanitarian aid is not flowing through Kerem Shalom. But the fact of the matter is that the humanitarian aid has been tripled in the last couple of weeks. More than 800 trucks of goods are entering on a daily basis to Gaza. The prices of merchandise went so much down because there is a flow of merchandise there in Gaza. So I wouldn't say that there is a humanitarian aid problem in Gaza, although in the last couple of days, because of Hamas firing rockets, that has been a problem. And I would add to that is that one problem that hasn't been solved is the fact of that from the Rafah crossing point, but from other points as well, Hamas took control completely on distributing the humanitarian aid. And as long as Hamas is controlling the humanitarian aid, they have the force. And at the end of the day, the most important and urgent thing is releasing the hostages, a hostage deal. And if you don't have any leverages, and if you have tripled the humanitarian aid, if you took out the army from Gaza, and you have no probable or you don't have significant leverages, then it's hard to conduct negotiations on this basis. So you have to resume the leverages, and one of them is entering to Rafah. This is the military leverage, which is so needed.
Arwa, I'm interested to hear your response to that.
I mean, look, I have absolutely no idea where you're getting those numbers on humanitarian aid truck allowed into Gaza. On the 5th of May, which is the last time that, trucks made it through either Kerem Shalom or Rafah, there were around 130 trucks that actually made it inside. In terms of Hamas taking control of the aid and distributing it, I'm sorry, that's just ludicrous. I have a charity. We operate on the ground. Hamas is most certainly absolutely not controlling, touching, or even interacting with us. We don't see them. You can go into Gaza. I was in Gaza for a week with my charity. You don't see this mysterious entity of, Hamas that's out there above ground. You don't see Hamas operatives controlling water trucks or flour being distributed or diapers or any of that sort. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement, if this is ever going to be moved forward, that things can and should be done, and sort of punting the blame over to that so many are declaring to be a terrorist entity and saying that, their bad behavior is somehow justifying the bad behavior of a democratically elected nation state. I mean, that's a logic that has to stop being applied.
Now, you said that you were recently in the Gaza Strip, Arwa. I'm interested to hear, we saw, and maybe you can just give us some feedback about what you heard from people on the ground in regards to support for Hamas at this point. Obviously, when we saw the news that Hamas had agreed to a ceasefire deal on the table, one that Israel said it ultimately had not agreed to, we saw people celebrating in the street because they were happy to see a ceasefire. Do the people right now in Gaza want to see the continued leadership of Hamas post-war?
I can tell you this. I did not speak to a single person inside Gaza that wanted to see Hamas in power or that even expressed a remote piece of support for Hamas. we have to remember that prior to October 7th, a poll that was conducted by an entity that is fairly credible called the Arab Barometer saw that support for Hamas, and this is again before October 7th, was at around 24%. All Gazans want right now is for this to end. They want a ceasefire. They want to be able to breathe. They want to be able to live, and they want to be able to start moving towards some sort of a future that does not involve living in a perpetual state of fear for 24 hours a day.
Are we seeing any pressure on Hamas leaders to surrender, to put down arms, to release the hostages from amongst the Gazan population?
I mean, in the sense of, it's not as if Hamas leaders are out there or, the Gazan population can actually access them at this stage. I mean, that's just a very basic, one would think that with some of the sort of concessions that, Hamas is making on some of its positions, that they are sensing that, they don't have the support of the population, that they're going to have to, bring about what the population right now wants the most, which is basically a ceasefire and for all of this to end. But to sort of assume that, the population of Gaza can somehow do something against, Hamas is a bit illogical. One needs to understand, the psyche of every single individual there. You have a population that has lost so much and is also psychologically crushed and obliterated. All they have been through in the last 7 months has effectively resulted in so many people just literally trying to find the strength to breathe every single day, scrounge around, some food, maybe if they're lucky, find clean water and try to keep themselves and their families alive. But there is a sort of sense that, people are so beyond fed up right now, and they are highly aware of the fact that they are, pawns in all of this. They are pawns for Hamas. They're pawns for Israel. They're pawns for every single, entity that actually exists there. Gazans have not had agency over any aspect of their lives for the last 17 years, ever since this came into power and Israel imposed its blockade. And all of that has been taken away from them to an even greater degree right now.
All right, I'd like to turn to
sure. I mean, when I listen to your guest, I'm the words of the president is echoing in my head, which is that people forgot what happened 7.5 months ago. Actually, there were 3 waves of people of murderers and terrorists that slaughtered and raped and killed Israelis. One is obviously the Hamas fighters, the Nukhba. The second is the mob that entered, and the third, and as we saw clearly and in the cameras, are the mob and that tried to lynch all the hostages that were kidnapped. I saw completely different polls in which gave Hamas the vast majority and still gives Hamas a vast majority. And this is the outcome of years of propaganda and education that was given to those people, that the only thing is to kill the Israelis and to slaughter them. And this is why we have to defend ourselves. And this is what we are doing. And saying that the Hamas has only 20% support and no Hamas people, and they don't want, and they are pawns of the Hamas, this is not seeing the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that people are cheering and still cheering for the Hamas, want to see the Hamas, and as long as they are participating in the acts of horror that the Hamas is conducting, they are collaborators. And this is what is happening in Gaza, unfortunately. And we'll need years of a different education than UNRWA was giving those people in order to change their hearts and minds, unfortunately.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up this conversation. We have to move on to our next story. Arwa Damon, thank you so much for joining us from Turkey. I hope we'll have you back soon on air. All right, with tensions high across the Middle East, Iran again is in the spotlight following critique over its lack of cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Take a look.
A ticking time bomb. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, came out on Tuesday, strongly criticizing Iran's failure to cooperate with the agency's probe into its nuclear program.
The present state is completely unsatisfactory. unsatisfactory for me. We have almost at an impasse where nothing is moving apart from the normal, traditional set of inspections under CSA, and this needs to change.
Iran and the UN Nuclear Agency are still discussing how to implement a 2023 deal on inspections. Tensions have grown between Iran and the IAEA since 2018, when then President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew America from Tehran's nuclear deal with world leaders. Since then, Iran has abandoned all limits the deal put on its program and enriches uranium to 60% purity, near weapons-grade levels of 90%. Grossi has already warned that Tehran has enough enriched material at near weapons-grade levels to make several nuclear devices if it opted to do so. He emphasized that the agency cannot guarantee that none of Iran's centrifuges have been utilized under the veil clandestine enrichment. Mohammad Islami, the head of Iran's atomic energy organization, responded by jabbing at Israel, accusing it of meddling in the relationship between the IAEA and Iran.
This criminal entity has been behind the destructive campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and things raised by this regime should no longer be used as basis for inspection by the IAEA.
Grossi's visit comes at a time of extremely heightened regional tensions, following an unprecedented attack on Israel directly from Iranian soil, and the subsequent yet limited Israeli response, a direct warning to Iran that Israel can precisely penetrate defenses that guard Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel has vowed to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Following his visit to Isfahan, Grossi stressed there is no simple measure to deal with the slew of issues that still need to be addressed.
There is some kind of expectation sometimes that there will be a touch of a magic wand and we will solve issues like this. I'm sorry, this does not exist. It's impossible.
Grossi reaffirmed the validity of the existing agreement with Iran, but called to uphold safeguards and monetary measures to address the international community's concerns. The biggest question still remains unanswered. When will Iran's endeavors cross Israel's red line?
Our White Counsel in Los Angeles and Jacob Lepin, military and strategic affairs analyst at Miriam Institute, will be having you back soon. Unfortunately, we don't have time for you to respond to the story that we just saw, but a sad piece of news has come out for Tel Aviv. The famous Tel Aviv Pride Parade won't be held this year in its typical exciting form. Usually, tens of thousands of people gather on the Tel Aviv promenade from around the world to celebrate LGBTQ rights, but this year, that will be replaced with an assembly focused on pride, hope, and liberty in honor of the 132 hostages who are still being held captive in the Gaza Strip. Now, the mayor of Tel Aviv says that this is not the time for celebrations. That's why they made this choice. And that some of the budget intended for the march, which typically takes place in June, has been now redirected to support the Tel Aviv Municipal LGBT Community Center. Well, the Pride Parade in Jerusalem is going to be taking place this year. So that will be happening. And for those who want to join in here in Tel Aviv, they're just going to have to wait until June of 2025. Well, Eurovision 2024 has kicked off in Malmo, Sweden, and the singing contest is already revealing its politics, even though music and politics are not supposed to intertwine, as they keep on saying. The opening act last night featured Swedish singer Erik Saade performing his 2011 Eurovision song with the keffiyeh wrapped around his wrist, which is a Palestinian symbol often used in pro-Palestinian protests. Contestants, performers, and fans are barred from displaying any flags that don't represent the countries competing in the contest or from displaying or making any political gestures, yet the Swedish singer was not reprimanded in any way. However, Israeli fan and comedian Guy Hochman was arrested in Malmo for waving an Israeli flag. He's since been released with a warning. Well, tonight, Israel's performer Eden Golan is going to compete in the second semi-final, and our correspondent Christopher Barolin is there with this update.
So far, so good. Yeah, yesterday there was the first semi-final live with the audience. Israel wasn't there, but there was one pro-Palestinian protest outside of the arena. Inside of the arena, there was only one ex-contestant of the Eurovision Song Contest that was waving kind of an Arab symbol, and he has been blamed by the organizer. Tonight there will be the rehearsal for the second semi-final with Israel, and we will see if there will be protest outside of the arena or inside of the arena. There was the first rehearsal this afternoon. It was amazing. Eden Golan has great vocals, a great staging. So let's see how the next hours are going to be. Earlier today I could speak with the spokesperson of the Jewish community here in Malmo, and indeed there is this feeling of unsafety here in Malmo, and overmore since the 7th of October. I could meet him a bit earlier today and hear what he told me.
If we're talking about this week, I think a lot of Jewish people are worried, for sure. And I know families who've gone away, actually, these days, because they don't want to be here when the demonstrations will start, and who knows what might happen. So, of course, these are worrying times. We're also worried, of course, what's happening in Israel, to be for sure. I mean, there is a war going on, and so there are many things to be worried about, for sure. But the community is continuing with their activities, and services will be here in the synagogue, and so that will not change at all.
All right. Well, looking forward to watching that performance myself. I'd like to thank you all so much.